LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the parents of one of the girls killed when a car crashed into a school have told LBC they're unconvinced police worked tirelessly to get answers. An investigation into the collision in Wimbledon last July, which killed 8-year-olds Nurio Sajjad and Selena Lau, has been reopened. The driver, who suffered a seizure, had been told she won't face criminal charges. Nurio's mother, Smira Chauhan, exclusively spoke to us earlier.
We shouldn't be here talking to you. We should be on a half-term with our daughter. Why are we here? We are not even healing yet. We've got this fight ahead, and we are hopeful.
Convicted serial killer Lucy Letby's lost a Court of Appeal bid to challenge her conviction for the attempted murder of a baby girl. She was found guilty of trying to kill a newborn known as Child K following a retrial in July. Well, LBC's correspondent Chris Chambers has more.
Lawyers for Letby told the Court of Appeal the attempted murder charge should have been stayed as an abusive process because of what they said was overwhelming prejudice caused by media coverage in her first trial. On that basis, they say the retrial shouldn't have gone ahead. But the appeal by her legal team was dismissed by 3 senior judges who said right at the very start of the ruling they would refuse permission for her to challenge that conviction.
The Chancellor's confirmed she's tweaking debt rules to allow her to increase borrowing for public investment by around £50 billion. But Conservative Shadow Minister Chris Philp claims she's been dishonest.
She promised before the election she would not fiddle the borrowing rules. She fought and won the general election with a certain set of plans, and within a matter of weeks she has ripped those up, and worse than that, she's ripped them up in America. She hasn't even had the courtesy of telling the House of Commons.
The Chancellor says leading British economists support increasing the debt threshold. The UN's warned the goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century could soon be dead. Its environmental programmes warned we're on track to reach a rise in temperatures of 3.1 degrees. And £1.5 million is being made available to help victims of the Windrush scandal claim compensation. The government's also making good on its manifesto pledge by appointing a commissioner to ensure they have their voices heard. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 10 points at 82.69. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.19. LBC weather largely dry in the east tonight. Outbreaks of rain in western and northern areas and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. It's Thursday, so what do we do at 8 o'clock on a Thursday? We get someone in who I find interesting, or if they've got a book out, or they're doing something that is a little bit out of the ordinary, and we talk to them, and then you talk to them as well. Well, today we are in the company of Baroness Sayeeda Warsi. She's got a book out, which is called Muslims Don't Matter. And there's a quote from David Baddiel on the front of it, which is so small I'm now going to try and read it. There is no more powerful fighter for the cause that Muslims do, should and must matter than Sayeeda Warsi. That's quite a good thing to have on the front of a book called Muslims Don't Matter, isn't it? Especially as David Baddiel is Jewish. And you do welcome, by the way. You do a podcast with David as well, don't you?
I do. We've been doing that podcast for most of this year. It's been a really difficult podcast to do, but a really important one, because what we found was that over the last 12 months, the relationship between British Jews and British Muslims is so fractured. And the spaces where often these relationships and conversations will be taking place just wasn't happening. And we just felt that we needed to, one, be repeating things that we were talking about amongst our own communities, but also share that with each other and try and find a way, a human way, really, through all the awfulness that we've seen over the last 12 months.
And it's really worked, hasn't it? Because, I mean, if you'd said to me, right, let's do a podcast, we need to have someone Jewish and someone who's a Muslim, I'm not sure I'd have put the two of you together, but it works.
It does. I mean, in many ways, we're both outsiders and insiders within our own communities. I mean, he's so obviously Jewish and proud of it and talks about it. And I'm so obviously, kind of Muslim, and I talk about it, and I've never hidden it away as an aspect of my identity. And yet, in many ways, there are lots in the Jewish community who would argue that he wasn't, he's married out. He doesn't really consider himself. He considers himself very much a secular Jew. I come from a very, very mixed theological background. And, I've had times when I've been on an ISIS kill list, for example. So there are many people who, didn't really like what I had to say. So I think because of that, we just felt that not only could we represent and speak for what we were hearing within our own communities, but we could also find a way of just, listening to each other and often disagreeing, but being able to sit with disagreement and hopefully trying to show that even in the most difficult of circumstances, you can have the most difficult of conversations, but you can do it in a really civilized, compassionate way.
So the book, as I said, is called Muslims Don't Matter. It's got into the Sunday Times top 20 bestsellers, which is a real achievement for any book. Why did you write it? Because it's quite a provocative title, isn't it?
I just became angry and fearful and lots of kind of emotions earlier this year. And it was literally I'd been writing about this stuff for a while and I'd been talking about this stuff for a while. But earlier this year, my husband and I were on a walk in Yorkshire, and we go to this place regularly called Nostell Priory. It's around the corner from where we live. And as we were walking there, I said to him, X, one of my siblings, has just decided to buy a house somewhere else. And I said, you do realise that's 3 out of the 5 of us that have now bought and we haven't. And I said, do you think we're the kind of mad ones that are not looking for an alternative place? Because every time they're looking to buy somewhere, they're talking about it as being a sanctuary home, a kind of place where they can move to, plan B, an exit route. And I said, are we going to be like those Jewish families who were sat there in the 1920s and 30s saying, oh, don't be so crazy, it can never get that bad. And then they were the ones caught up in the awfulness of whatever came after, and those that got out. And he just said, look, if you, as somebody who is at the heart of the establishment, a Privy Councillor, an ex-member of the Cabinet, somebody who sits in the House of Lords, if people like you start to make plan Bs, then I'm afraid we've lost this battle already. And I just thought, I need to write and explain how British Muslims are feeling, how the most integrated, successful people, Muslims in this country, are feeling like they don't belong and they don't matter. I remember for me, Iain, we're coming up to 70 years since my granddad migrated to this country. And we have generation after generation who, and I say this in the book, who have served this country. Both my paternal and maternal grandfather served in the British Indian Army. I have a great uncle who was taken prisoner of war in the Second World War. And I have a child who's back in uniform in our armed forces. And obviously I served at the Cabinet. My dad, worked in the mills in Yorkshire. And built a life for himself and, opportunities for others. And it just felt like a really scary place to be, that here we were talking about exit routes. So I suppose in some ways it's my heartbreak. It is heartbreak. There's a lot of heartbreak in this book because I speak with great sadness about where we've ended up, but I also speak with great fear. And I underpin all of that because obviously the lawyer in me has to constantly kind of present the evidence and the data and the statistics and the polling and the, research. And I just felt like in a really short read, probably you could read that book in about 3 hours, under 3 hours. I was trying to say to people, this is how we feel as British Muslims, and this is why we feel like this, and this is what we need to do to stop.
People could write a book called Jews Don't Matter. They could write a book called Christians Don't Matter. And we could probably go through a whole load of groups that books could be written about. Why do you think it's worse for Muslims in this country than any other group at the moment?
I do. And it's one of the things that David and I talk about on the podcast all the time. We always say, let's not have the victim Olympics when we talk about these things. And then we start talking about quite specifics. And I remember we had a conversation when Oppenheimer was out, and there was all this conversation about why a Jew didn't play Einstein and why a Jew didn't play, these great kind of Jewish characters in these amazing movies that won at the Oscars. And I said to him, God, that's such a first world problem, you know, David, because here we are having conversations about why Jews are not playing, why Jewish people are not playing great Jewish characters in great movies about great Jews. And I said, and I'm sat there going, I wish you'd stop projecting all Muslims as terrorists. I mean, forget about a Muslim playing a good a Muslim character. I'm just satisfied with anybody playing any Muslim character. And one of the things that I do in the book is I go through how art and culture and sport and film and theatre and all of these places where these tropes about Muslims are perpetuated.
That's a really interesting point, because I've started rewatching Spooks. I don't know if that was something that you watched back in the day. But I would say probably about 25% of the plot lines in that series are about Muslim terrorists. Now, I mean, we know that there have been lots of terror attacks perpetrated, but I'm not going to say, well, they would describe themselves as Muslims. I'll describe them as Islamists. But that's an interesting word which you talk about in the book, which we'll maybe come on to in a moment. You look at 24, again, mainly about terror plots, mainly about Muslims. And they're not the only two series that do that. And they are brilliant. I love watching them, and they are brilliant. But you think, well, because of 9/11, this has become, and then the 7/7 attacks, etc., this has become such a thing now. And I've told this anecdote so many times that people are probably bored with it, but I don't think I've told it to you, so I'm going to tell you it now. This was a couple of years ago now. A friend of mine rang me up and said, "Oh, we've got new Muslim neighbours." I said, "Oh, right." He goes, "Yeah, but you know." I said, "What do you mean, you know?" And he said, "Well, I mean, they could be terrorists." And I sort of rolled my eyes and thought, seriously, do people still think like that? Anyway, 2 weeks later, he rings me up again. I said, "Oh, how are you getting on with your neighbours then?" "Oh, we're in each other's houses all the time." And it's the fear of the unknown. If you've never met a Muslim and all you've done is watch 24 or Spooks, you've got it in your head that, well, not every Muslim is a terrorist, but too many would be. And it's like there's so many things in our society. If we don't know them, there is a natural fear. And I think that is endemic in many communities in our country who don't have day-to-day contact with Muslims. I mean, the constituency I stood in North Norfolk, I mean, I doubt whether there are many, even nowadays, I doubt whether there are many mosques in North Norfolk. So, I mean, is that a real issue still for you?
So, interestingly, when I write, I mean, there's so much that you've just raised in that question. That when I write, I always write for Doris in Devon. And I always say Doris in Devon has probably never met a Muslim and reads the Daily Mail and is sat there in her home thinking, oh, my God, they're here to get me and they're coming to get me and this is what they're going to do. And I break that down into so many different things. First of all, the way in which a community is perceived is the way in which it's spoken about. And if you consistently, through film or through politics or through the media, keep perpetuating certain things about what Muslims are, then over time, whether you meet them or you don't meet them, the poisoning of the public discourse has already been done. And eventually it results in what we saw this summer with the riots on the street. But for me, I think what fascinates me is if you look at actual numbers, there are far more Muslim doctors in this country than there are terrorists who have been from the Muslim faith. And yet we don't consistently put out the message that, damn these Muslim lifesavers, constantly saving our lives, constantly making us better.
Well, I've just had my gallbladder taken out by one of them.
Right, well, there you go. And so I say, why do we choose to demonize and stereotype and stigmatize Muslims in a certain way? And that has real life consequences. So, for example, so many movies, Black Hawk Down, American Sniper, these movies that were kind of celebrated in so many ways and watched by millions of people around the globe led to real attacks on real communities in the United States. And I talk about that again in the book. And so this is the issue for me, to say that over time, it's easy, let's blame those guys who were, rioting on the streets over the summer and wanting to look for a Muslim and burn down a mosque. Yeah, of course it's right that they were charged and convicted and sentenced. But let's look at the damage that's been done upstream. And the damage upstream, and I log it in a lot of detail there, over 20 years now, nearly, Iain. And I've watched it at close quarters because, I've had the privilege of sitting at the table where the power is and where the decisions are made, as well as sitting within communities, I've seen how this has been quite deliberate by certain think tanks, certain politicians, certain media outlets, this drip, drip, drip of poisoning of the public discourse around who Muslims are. And that's why I think this conversation needs to happen. You know, the book for me is not an end in itself. It's a means to starting a conversation. And already, you know, we're kind of crisscrossing the country, doing, you know, having these conversations. And I start each one by saying, nothing is off the table. And as long as we are prepared to have this conversation in the spirit of learning, and it's civilized and civilizing, then let's have that conversation. But time and time again, as I show in that book, Muslims are simply held to standards, judged in ways that no other community is.
Mark in Liverpool has got the text of the evening so far. He goes, coming over here, taking our gallbladders. Anyway, lots more with Sayeeda Warsi in just a moment. Then we'll be coming to your calls. Quite a few already on the board, so do keep them coming. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
17 minutes past 8. Sayeeda Warsi with me talking about her book Muslims Don't Matter. Top 20. I mean, that's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not top 10, is it? So that's just a perfection.
I mean, even Liz Truss got into the top 10, Sayeeda.
Yeah, but she was Prime Minister, even if it was for 44 days.
Now,
I wonder if the Lettice wrote a book.
No, there's a thought. Before we come to calls, I want to talk about some meanings of words, because whenever I talk about terrorists perpetrated by people who say they are acting in a certain way for a certain reason, I always call them Islamist. I don't call them Islamic. I don't call them Muslims, because I don't believe that, I mean, they believe that they are acting on behalf of the Prophet Allah or whatever, but there is it's semantics, but there has to be a difference between them and ordinary God-fearing, law-abiding Muslims. And society seems to have come to the conclusion, I don't know who society is, but you call them Islamist rather than Islamic.
So I don't like the term Islamist because it has got about 20 odd different meanings. It's a bit like the word Zionist, right? Islamism is the political manifestation of Islam, just like Zionism is the political manifestation of Judaism. And what you can be a Zionist where you can simply say, I believe in the state of Israel, or you can be an extremist Zionist where you can basically say, I want to take over Jordan and a bit of Syria and a bit of Saudi Arabia, and I believe in extremist settler movements, right? And both of them are Zionists. So when you use the term, it's really important to know what you're talking about. Just like Islamists could be a whole load of governments around the world, a bit like the Christian Democrats in Europe and different political parties that are framed by Christian democracy, or you could be ISIS. And so unless you are prepared to have the long-form academic conversation, I never use the word Islamist and I never use the word Zionist, because I just think unless you're prepared to have the explanation of what you mean by that, don't use it. And also, I think, quoting David Cameron, as I do in the book, one of the things that he said in his early days when he was looking at all of this stuff was that, most people, when you say Islamist, think you mean Muslims. Doris and Devon doesn't make an academic distinction between Islamic, Islam, Muslim or Islamist, right? They all sound the same. And so I think it's really important that what we say is there are criminals, terrorists, and those terrorists can be inspired by everything from, issues around religion, or they could be inspired by their misogynistic attitude, incels, for example. There's a whole range of reasons why people go out and commit terrorist attacks, and they will justify and root it in something. And they're criminals and they're terrorists.
But the big terrorist attacks, they're not always, but often have been carried out by people that say they are doing it in the name of their religion. So we in the media have to call them something. You can't just sort of lump them in as just terrorists. Every terrorist has a reason behind what they're doing, whether it's somebody who's extreme right-wing or fundamentalist Christian or whatever. So what should we call them?
So it's not true that most terrorist attacks are committed by people who do so in the name of Islam. Certainly in the Western world, they're not. And if you look at the US, in fact, my first book, and I'll plug that as well, The Enemy Within, I say that in the United States, overwhelmingly, the terrorist attacks are committed by...
To be fair to myself, I don't think I said that most terrorist attacks are carried out by Muslims. But the ones that are, we still have to have some way of describing them.
Well, we don't describe other terrorist attacks by defining them through their religion.
No, because often they don't use their religion as the excuse. Andras Breivik didn't say, well, I did this because I'm a Christian.
He talked a lot about Christian ideology in that, by the way, and he talked a lot about extreme right-wing ideology, and he talked about that being rooted in Christian values, and he talked about what he called this agenda of the Muslim takeover of Eurabia, the kind of takeover of Europe by Muslims. So all of his ideology was rooted in that. And there are many people who go out and commit terrorist attacks in the name of, Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism, or, the rise of extremist Hindutva terrorism is on the rise. But I don't think we need to define it in that way. I think it's important to say either somebody is a terrorist and they commit criminal acts, or we have people who are part of a faith. And I'll give you an example. There was a little experiment done recently about child sexual exploitation. And they looked at the language that was used by the media in relation to a gang of men who were involved in child sexual exploitation who were brown, and a gang of men who were involved in child sexual exploitation and they were white. And the race of the white group was never spoken about in the media reporting of them, but the race of the brown group was consistently spoken about in the reporting of them. So again, I go back to this. Why is it that we need to refer to Asian paedophiles as Asian paedophiles, but white paedophiles as not white paedophiles? Either we refer to all of them as paedophiles, which is what they are, and convicted. But if we make race an issue, then somehow what we're basically saying is that is a contributing factor. And that's when I say we're not dealing with people on the basis of their criminality, we're dealing with them on the basis of their race or religion. And that is my definition of when we start to bring racism to the fore.
And what about Islamophobia? Because often when we talk about these issues on the radio, I'll get people calling in or texting in saying, well, there's no such thing. But clearly there is. You can describe it as a hatred of Muslims, but Islamophobia surely covers that.
Yeah, Islamophobia is just anti-Muslim racism. Just like anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish racism.
Why do people get so excited about the fact that sort of we would use that word?
I suppose because every time you argue for equal worth and value and you get society to accept the latest form of bigotry, whether that's misogyny or homophobia or whatever it is, people come to that debate kicking and screaming. There was a time when we said we weren't nasty to women, we just didn't give them the vote, and we didn't think they were of equal worth and couldn't own property, and we didn't think they should work after they got married, right? But we didn't think we were misogynistic. We just thought that was society. And it was the same with gay people. We had all sorts of views views, including within, we've been culprits in that. The Conservative Party, I've been a part of that, where we said, well, we can't trust them. We can't have them in our armed forces. We chemically castrated them. Come on. But we didn't think we were homophobic. We just thought we were doing what society expected us to do. So I'm not surprised that this latest form of racism and this latest form of bigotry, we're having to bring policymakers to it kicking and screaming, because every time we've fought for equality, whether as a woman or a gay man or a gay woman or a black man or whatever, we've had to bring people to this issue kicking and screaming. And so, in the book, I explain in detail what Islamophobia is, anti-Muslim racism, how it manifests itself, and how it's important that in an equalities framework in the United Kingdom, nobody should be discriminated for their racialized identity. It's really important to point out, though, Iain, this is not about religion. This is not about when you are subjected to Islamophobia. And again, I give details in the book. Two of the most horrific attacks, one of the most horrific attacks was Dr. Bamra, a Sikh dentist in Wales who was attacked with a machete and had, life-changing injuries. He was a Sikh. There was another attack of another Sikh man outside Parliament when he had his turban knocked off, and he was told, he was called a dirty Muslim. These people are not even Muslim, right? So anti-Muslim racism is directed at all sorts of people. There was an incident which was went to trial at the Old Bailey, where he was, I think, an Italian man, nothing to do with the religion of Islam, but because of the colour of his skin, he was perceived to be Muslim. So I think it's really important that anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia is not about protecting the faith. It is about protecting people who are racialized through a religious identity and either are Muslim or are perceived to be Muslim.
Now, Lee has sent in a WhatsApp message which contains virtually every anti-Muslim, but every trope that you could possibly imagine. So let's read it to you, and maybe you can reassure him, Sayeeda. Hi, Iain. It's just such a shame that Muslims tend to keep to their own communities. They do not wish to be British. They want to be Muslims. They take over large areas, so many mosques. They look down on our British way of life, the way we live. They think they're better and superior to us. It's so sad to see their women covered head to toe in black cloth. I don't think they wish to live with us, but just to live here in the UK.
I would say, Lee, first of all, I'm here because...
You were born here.
I was born here, but because Britain was there, right? Britain was in what was the British Empire, in what was British India, an India in which my great-grandparents and grandparents were, a British India for which both my grandparents, as I said, served, and a British India which, after being made independent, and when the British left, reached out to British India, which was now India-Pakistan, and said, if you have workers, please come and help us rebuild our country. It's when my grandfather came over. So if they didn't want to live with Brits, they wouldn't have come to this country. They thought they were coming to what they thought was part of what they'd always been. They'd always had a British identity and a British citizenship. But this nonsensical stuff about making judgments about Muslim communities just horrifies me. And I think I start the book by saying, I'm done. I'm done with explaining and caveating and condemning and apologising and explaining and justifying. I'm done. Why should I wake up every morning and put up with, ignorant Lee who has to ask me these questions? It would be as stupid as me saying, what is wrong with white people? They all go around drinking and they all beat their wives up and they all do this. And it's just rubbish. It's racism. I come from Yorkshire, and around where I live, there are these old mining villages. And, the culture in some of these mining villages is still very interesting. They're all, they're large white communities, very little diversity. And as somebody told me recently, where a lot of the men expect the tea on table when they get home. And, there is all sorts of questions around, relationships and family breakdown and violence and all of that. I don't judge that to be all white people. I don't make judgments about all white communities. You know why? Because I take people as individuals. I think there are good uns and bad uns in all communities. And until we get to the point where we start seeing individuals as individuals, rather than these big community monolithic blocks who all have the same traits, because the minute we describe them as monolithic blocks with the same traits, that is racism.
I'm sure you've seen Andrew Gilligan's review of your book in the Times.
I welcomed it, actually.
Do you mind if I read the first paragraph out? Because I think it is he makes an interesting point. He says, the scales have fallen from Sayeeda Warsi's eyes. Baroness Warsi, the first Muslim to sit in cabinet and former co-chair of the Conservative Party, now realises that the country that made her appear at 36 is a place where Muslims are shut out of decision-making. With the exceptions of recent exceptions, as she doesn't say, of the mayor of its capital, the Justice Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, the Education Secretary, the Health Secretary, the First Minister of Scotland, the head of the Number 10 Policy Unit, the 25 Muslim MPs elected in 2024, and the thousands of Muslim civil servants and councillors. Now, the reason I read that out is not to sort of make you angry at all, but I mean, the point is, he's saying, well, look, there are so many Muslims that have risen to the top of our society now in a way that even 15 years ago would have been unthinkable. Surely that is a matter for celebration.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But at the same time, what I'm not prepared to accept is, because there have been exceptions, that the experience of the vast majority, overwhelming majority of Muslim communities has been one of concern, and more concern in recent times. And in my book, I explain how Muslim communities have been shut out of the decision-making process through this policy of disengagement. And I detail it going right back 17 years as to how it started, what was the thinking behind it, and what it's led to, and how over time it's diminished the development of civil society space. But I think it's really important to go back to Andrew Gilligan. And I said this when his review came out. Andrew Gilligan wrote a piece about me in which he basically said that I was at this, there was this Islamist kind of plot entryist plot of all these extreme Muslims at the heart of Whitehall. And guess who was behind it? Me. And
pulling the levers.
Yeah, pulling the levers.
Stroking your white cat
exactly as I did it. And anyway, the article subsequently was completely dismissed by government ministers. But the individuals that he named in that, look, I'm old and ugly enough not to give a damn about what Gilligan and people like that have to say. But the people that he named in that, individuals who were working and supporting government at the time, a government that I was a part of, one of them was a Deputy Lord Lieutenant. One of them was somebody who I think who'd worked with the High Sheriff's Office. Somebody who'd been given an honour. Somebody who ran a network of community really amazing individuals. These people were so petrified about the damage that this article had done to them that in the end government had to formally issue a letter to basically say this article was absolute nonsense. There was no truth in it because these guys were concerned about getting stopped at airports and their reputations being damaged in the world of, in the private sector and in the world of business because of it. Andrew Gilligan has been pulled up so many times for writing articles about Muslims which turn out to be completely false, and then they have to apologise and pay damages for libel et al. So it is astonishing that the Times newspaper decided to commission Andrew Gilligan, the man behind that very article that tried to demonise me and so many other Muslims, which was subsequently turned out to was shown to be a complete pile of tosh, to actually review my book. In a way, I suppose what it says is what it says on the book: Muslims don't matter.
Well, we're going to see what our callers think. There'll be lots of people with questions for you. We've got a full switchboard. Actually, we've got one space left, which somebody will fill in the next 10 seconds, I'm sure. We'll come to your calls in a moment. It's 8:33 News Headlines with Darryl Jackson.
The parents of one of the girls killed when a car crashed into a primary school in Wimbledon last summer have told LBC they can't heal without answers. Police have reopened an investigation into the collision, having previously told the driver she would face no criminal charges. The Shadow Chancellor's warned plans to change the way government debt is measured could push up mortgage costs. Jeremy Hunt has warned against increasing borrowing after Rachel Reeves confirmed she wants to alter the rules to boost investment. And Lucy Letby's been told she cannot challenge her conviction for the attempted murder of a baby girl following a retrial. Her lawyers had argued she faced overwhelming prejudice due to media coverage of previous proceedings. LBC weather largely dry in the east tonight. Outbreaks of rain in western and northern areas and a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:36. I should have said we are streaming this live on Global Player. If you'd never heard of Sayeeda Warsi, don't know what she looks like, well, now's your chance to find out. Right, let's go to your calls. Let's go to Adila in Bristol. Adila, hi.
Hi there. Hi.
What would you like to ask?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just make a comment about the book, having read the book, and I did actually read it in a 3-hour stint. And the reason why I read it in a 3 hours, less than 3 hour stint, was because it resonated with so many of the experiences that myself and many other Muslims across certainly Bristol and wider feel. But what my question was given the experiences sort of described in the book, and given the position that Sayeeda Warsi holds in the political arena, what advice would she give to the Prime Minister, assuming that he's read it within the 3 hours as well, of course, in terms of actions and what he could do to reduce Islamophobia and change the narrative and the rhetoric that we currently have across media and across politics? And then what would she also advise the new leader of the Conservative Party to root out Islamophobia within its midst?
So we haven't even gone near the Conservative Party yet, have we? So we can do that in the answer to Adila's question, Sayeeda.
The Conservative Party, I would say to both the prospective leaders, is, read the book and understand what it is that we're trying to explain in terms of the rhetoric that you put out and the impact it has on people's lives. As far as the Prime Minister is concerned, I think there is some hope that this government is wanting to do something in this area. I think certainly for the last 4, 5, 6 years, there's been nothing. In fact, it's gone backwards. And lots of work around community cohesion and integration has just simply not been there. I think this government recognises, and certainly does after what happened in the summer, that this work now needs to happen quite urgently. So everything from trying to find a definition of Islamophobia to trying to find a way in which the equalities framework adopts and embraces and protects people against anti-Muslim racism, to making sure that the Muslim community is engaged in the decision decision-making process. I think all of this, the government is definitely open to. I mean, from early conversations that I'm having with Labour colleagues, the goodwill is definitely there. And the book was launched by Wes Streeting, who was co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims alongside Anna Soubry, and were the chief architects of the work on Islamophobia. So I think there's a lot of good people on the within the Labour Party and at the top of the Labour Party who want to get this right. The challenge they're going to have is that, unfortunately, some of my colleagues have left a lot of landmines for them within the civil service, and that there are deep-bedded individuals in government at the moment, many of them from organisations like the Henry Jackson Society et al., who have a certain take on Muslims and British Muslims. And I think there is, therefore, a little bit of inbuilt hostility in certain sections of the civil service and advisory kind of space. So I think it will take them a little bit of time to work through that and to start moving to an evidence-based policy-making position rather than ideologically based.
You resigned the Conservative whip, but you haven't actually resigned from the Conservative Party, so you'll have a vote in the leadership election. Who will you vote for?
Well, I ummed and ahed about this, and I had some friends within the Conservative Party who sat down and said that, for all her faults, that, Kemi is more sane and less, or should I say, is less insane than Robert Jenrick. And I wasn't convinced, but I do think that if I had to, I do think that, I think one would probably take longer to put a whatever. I just think that it's really difficult for me to honestly, hand on heart, say that either one of them would not fight culture wars, and either one of them possess the right characteristics and character to be a sensible leader of the opposition. So although my instinct initially was Kemi, I've decided to sit this one out.
I never understand people who just sit it out.
I even tweeted about that and said, for the fact that people have fought so hard to win the right to vote in all sorts of spaces, that actually I had to feel that I had to exercise my vote. But then, if you look at, groups like the TRG, the Tory Reform Group, One Nation Conservatives, a lot of them aren't formally endorsing. And I also know from speaking to colleagues that not only are they not formally endorsing, some of them are not voting.
Well, they may get the result that they don't want then. But there we go. Adila, thank you very much for that. Let's go to Awad, who is in Barnet. Awad, hi, what would you like to say?
Hiya, thank you for having me on. It's not often that you get to speak to your heroes.
Ooh.
My question for Sayeeda is, when you look at marginalised communities such as the gay community and women who've sort of gained acceptance within most of mainstream British society, that means left and right wing, does their journey sometimes give you hope, or do you sometimes look at that and say, I feel like there's something missing that they might have been able to get at that we aren't?
I do take hope from it, Awad, because I talk about this in much more detail in my first book, where I said we didn't really like women very much, and then we didn't really like gay people very much, and then we didn't really like Jews very much, and then we didn't really like black people very much, and then we didn't really like the Catholics very much. And I kind of go through this to say how Britain has always managed to find people amongst it who it considers the other, who it's accused of being disloyal, how it's accused of not being trusted, of being the enemy within. And that each time it's taken time to work through all of that. But it hasn't happened automatically. Battles for equality have had to be fought, and they've been hard fought, and it's been a bruising experience. I'm sure Iain could talk to you about that. I have friends who were on the original, LGBT marches where they were asking for equality and equal worth and value, and they will tell you how appalling those early days were for the gay community. So I do look at them, and I am hopeful that once again, just like we considered others to be beyond the pale, the enemy within, the outsider, and didn't belong, then we will again work our way through this latest form of bigotry and racism. But the battle has to be fought. And what worries me at the moment is not that anti-Muslim racism is found in the far right or right, spaces. It's often found in the most liberal of spaces. That's the disturbing thing for me on this issue, that in the very spaces where you would expect racism and bigotry to be called out is the very spaces where this is almost our bigotry blind spot. And that's why I hope the book is picked up by, of course, people on the far right. They probably won't. But actually, I want liberal people to pick up this book and just check in with themselves and say, maybe I'm not quite getting this right. That's been the most positive thing for me, actually, in terms of feedback of the book, where people have said, I actually thought I knew this stuff really well. And then having read this, I've realised I've had to think again about how I say things and how I see things.
Thank you very much for that. Chris says, great interview with Baroness Warsi. For someone with such integrity, I'd like to know how many times she's wanted to throw the towel in and walk away from Westminster politics, and why. I should definitely seek out her podcast with David. No, she doesn't want that. She wants you to buy the book, Chris. Get with the agenda.
Listen to the podcast as well. You'll love it, actually.
Have you thought about just chucking it all in and going back to leading what would be a much more normal life?
One of the
things... But your husband suggested it a few times.
He has, and he's a Lib Dem, so you can't understand why I keep... Yeah, I mean, I call him the Tory wine fairy. He's been to more Tory Conservative dinners than, any Lib Dem that I know. We have been very lucky, and we have been... Both my husband and I have been huge social mobility success stories. We both come from really tough homes and working class backgrounds where we had nothing, and we've both had incredibly great careers, in law and in business. And it would be so easy to say, I'm all right, Jack. I live in the right part of town. Kids go to the right schools. We all ski in the same, nice resorts. Let's just forget about it. This isn't going to impact on me in the end. But the question I ask myself, and what keeps me going, is that if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? For all the kind of challenges that I've faced, I completely acknowledge that I'm privileged. I have the privilege of platform. I have the privilege of position. I have the privilege of being, financially independent. I have the privilege of having a wonderful home. I have the privilege of having an amazing partner, a wonderful family. It would be incredibly selfish of me. It would be the easy decision, but incredibly selfish of me at a time when there is such a sense of angst, really, between my faith and my country, for me to say, well, I'm not playing this, I've had enough, I'm walking away and I'm going to go sit on a beach somewhere. So yes, there are moments when I wake up in the morning and think, why am I doing this? And I do wake up in the morning and think, it must be amazing to be a straight white man and never feel like you have to worry about these things. Never have to look over your shoulder, never worry about where your grandkids are going to be, whether this place is still going to be a stable home for them. But in many ways, when I look at my grandkids, that too motivates me to continue to fight.
You have grandchildren?
I have 4 grandchildren.
Goodness me. I wasn't going to read this out on air, but I'm going to now you've said that. Ali says, just wanted to say Baroness Warsi is looking sensational. I'm watching on Global Player and younger with every appearance.
Oh, well, that's very kind. You see, grandparenting, being a nano suits me.
Right, we'll take more of your calls. Thank you very much for that one, Awad. It's 8:47.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Well, the thorny issue of reparations, credit to the Prime Minister, I think has struck the right tone. To engage in a conversation is surely dangerous, isn't it? Sarah's in Lincolnshire.
I don't agree with reparation. I think that the UK has been trying so hard to put things right over many, many decades, and I think we're doing a good job.
Matthew is in Exeter.
It is a time now to kind of park it under the sand and pay something back.
Ayub is in Stoke Newington. Do you agree with Matthew? We have to pay some money?
Absolutely disagree. We have got nothing to do with it. I've got nothing to do with it. My kids have got nothing to do with it.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7.
With Betfair, where odds move faster than polls. Play responsibly.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
10 to 9 on LBC. Several people having a bit of a go at you for what you said about straight white men. Joseph says, I'm a straight white man and I worry about all the things that Baroness Warsi has just suggested that we don't. We absolutely do. I don't know why she thinks that we don't.
No, I don't think what I meant was that, straight white men don't worry about the things that I worry about. But I think that the way in which you wake up every morning, the way I wake up every morning, and I have this deep, almost kind of in the pit of my stomach, where you don't feel like you can just get on with living a happy, kind of free, upbeat life. The fact that you feel that at any moment, as we saw in the summer, things could turn to a point where you're ringing up people and saying to them, don't go on the streets, don't go out today. The fact that I'm saying to my dad, please don't walk to the mosque. The fact that I'm talking to my siblings, talking to my kids to stay out of the public. That is something I always think, what must it feel like to wake up every morning and not think about misogyny, not think about bigotry and not think about racism, because it does not impact your life on a day-to-day basis. I think that's what I was trying to say.
OK. Let's go to Ferhan in Glasgow. Hello, Ferhan.
Oh, salam. Hello, Iain. Thanks for taking my call. Really what I wanted to mention was that I think it doesn't really matter what your politics are, who you are as a person. Just looking like a Muslim, as Baroness Lady Warsi has alluded to, even Sikh people are subjected to Islamophobic racism. I myself was subjected to a racist Islamophobic attack on Armistice Day last year. I was innocently at Waterloo Station and I got attacked. I got called a terrorist. I took a video of it, I put it online, and it got 27 million views, and they got charged and arrested, which is great. But my point is, it doesn't matter now. I happen to be gay. Now, I don't think that in most people's minds, or people that are Islamophobic, that that being gay really kind of is a part of that. You're either Muslim or you're gay. And so I guess my kind of question to Lady Warsi is, do you think that we as Muslims, we actually need to start to kind of talk more and be more obvious about the fact that, there are a diversity of Muslims out there, and maybe even show a little bit more acceptance of our LGBTQIA plus Muslim family members, and maybe like open that discussion up a bit more? And do you think that would actually kind of lessen Islamophobia in any way? Because that's often a stick that Muslims are beat with, that we are homophobic, we are misogynistic, we are all these terrible, terrible, terrible things. But I'm wondering, is it important for us to actually talk about these things and show acceptance of our, for example, LGBTQIA plus family members?
Yeah, Farhan, such an important question, and in many ways, talking about the book again, in my first book, I start by saying British Muslims are black and brown and Asian and Persian and bog standard Anglo-Saxon, and they're gay and straight and bisexual and whatever and whatever and whatever. And I kind of talk about the diversity of the community. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time actually working alongside gay and Muslim communities, in fact, did a podcast called Muslim Pride, where I interviewed first-hand accounts of what it was for people to be Muslim and gay. Of course, there's a huge diversity, but I think the part of me that I find disturbing is that why do we constantly have to show that we are normal? Why can it not just be accepted that we are? I think the reason why the book is so unapologetic, when it starts by saying, I'm done with apologising and explaining and justifying. I'm one of 5 girls. The other 4 are even more outspoken than I am. So you can imagine what our home is like. My poor dad has to put up with. My mum is one of 7. I have 5 female cousins from one aunt, 5 from another uncle. We have these huge female families, absolutely amazing women, pioneering in all sorts of worlds, going to battle, running businesses. Why should we have to constantly say, well, women are not all kind of hidden away and not given an opinion. Muslim women were prime ministers and presidents long before women in Europe were prime ministers and presidents. Muslim women were going to battle and leading men into battle long before women were allowed to be frontline officers in our armed forces in the United Kingdom. Muslim women were owning property and running businesses long before women in Europe were even allowed to own their own property. Now, if people are not prepared to understand history and read and understand fact and evidence, but want to take one trope about Muslim communities and superimpose that on the whole of the, community of 2 billion, which of course 1 billion will be women, and that's the judgment they want to make on them, then that's their ignorance.
But I think Furhan was referring to sort of maybe, there is a feeling that among Muslim communities, tolerance of homosexuals, lesbians, whatever, is not as high as it is among Christian or white communities. Now, obviously, that there are homophobes who are Christian and white as well. But I remember many years ago doing a phone-in on, well, what's it like to be Muslim and gay? And honestly, the calls that came in were heart-rending for people who are disowned by their families, which of course happens with white families too. But do you not think that sort of some social attitudes are sort of maybe a decade or two behind those of sort of normal liberal Western society?
Yeah, I think you make a really important point that all communities are on a journey, and it's really important for us to have those conversations. And for me, I've been incredibly privileged that I've been able to lead out this conversation from the centre of the community. But, would it shock you to know this, Iain, that in Victorian England, one of the reasons why people were anti-Muslim and didn't feel that Islam was a religion they wanted in Victorian England was because they felt that the story of the Prophet Lot was very clear in the Bible, but was not clear enough in the Quran, and that somehow Muslims were promiscuous and homosexual and promoted homosexuality. So in the past, we've hated Muslims for being promiscuous and promoting homosexuality. We're now hating them for being too conservative and being homophobic, right? We'll always find a reason to hate. And if you go back through European
people just for having sort of socially conservative views, you have those in all sections of society.
Yeah, but what's fascinating is that if you go into many African countries, the concern that many gay Muslim Africans will say is we have real problems with white evangelical Christians turning up from the United States into these African countries because they see them as the last bastion of being able to protect morality. Could more be done within Muslim communities to make sure that not only are LGBT communities tolerated, but actually accepted within society? Absolutely. Is it a debate that I am leading? Absolutely, and will continue to lead. Is it a debate that so many others within the community are leading? Absolutely, and will continue to lead. But to define Muslim communities as uniquely homophobic, that's the racism.
Well, you'll be interested to know we've had a lot of texts and WhatsApp messages praising you. We've also had the opposite, as you can imagine. You're used to that. But I hope that Lee, that WhatsApper that sent the most horrible WhatsApp text in, Lee, if you've got £14.99 spare, I would urge you to read Sayeeda's book because it's a very readable book. It's not one of these sort of pontificating books. It's a very human book, and I think maybe you might learn something from it. The book is called Muslims Don't Matter. It's by Sayeeda Warsi. It's $14.99 in hardback, and as Sayeeda says, it won't take you that long to read it, so I'd highly recommend it. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, in the next hour, I want to talk about cancer because Sir Chris Hoy says he's been blown away by the number of men seeking cancer advice since he revealed his terminal diagnosis earlier this week. He said that doctors have told him he has between 2 and 4 years to live. I can't imagine what my reaction would be if I had a similar diagnosis. Maybe you have, and you'd like to tell me how you coped with that. And I mean, it's probably the worst thing that anyone can say to you, apart from maybe sort of a family member has actually been killed or died. But to be diagnosed with cancer, which people always imagine is going to be a life-threatening disease, it isn't always. But what's been your reaction to being diagnosed with cancer?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the parents of one of the girls who died when a car drove into a school have exclusively told LBC they question whether police have worked tirelessly. The driver of the Land Rover which crashed in Wimbledon last July, who'd had a seizure, had been told she faces no further action. Now, police have reopened the investigation into the deaths of 8-year-olds Nuri